We're living through an age of job anxiety. Every week there's a new headline warning that artificial intelligence is coming for our livelihoods. We're told it could reshape everything from office jobs to creative work, and even professions that once seemed untouchable. And that fear isn't irrational. Big technological shifts have always reshaped labour markets. But while we're fixated on jobs that might disappear someday, something far more concrete is already happening. Countries around the developed world are quietly running out of teachers and doctors. These are some of the most stable jobs in the economy. They don't vanish in recessions, and societies quite literally cannot function without them. Yet, across the OECD, the teaching workforce is ageing fast, just as fewer people are coming in behind them. Shortages have existed in education for a long time, but they were usually manageable. Lately, they haven't been. According to UNESCO, maintaining today's education systems alone will require millions of new teachers by 2030. In healthcare, the picture is even starker. The World Health Organization warns of a global shortfall of around 11 million health workers by 2030, driven by ageing populations and medical staff retiring faster than they're being replaced. Everyone agrees this is a problem, and in practice, many developed countries have already leaned on the same solution. Instead of training more teachers and doctors, they've increasingly relied on immigration to keep schools and hospitals running. At first glance, that seems like a win-win. But this fix only works for as long as people stay, and increasingly, they don't. So, as always, we've got some important questions to answer. Why are essential workers disappearing in the first place? Why can't migration continue to be the solution for this issue? And what happens if this shortage becomes permanent? When making these videos, I go down a lot of rabbit holes online, and it can be easy to forget that not all websites are safe. Most are trying to take your information and sell it to the big tech companies for their gain. That's why I use Surfshark. It's a VPN, a virtual private network that encrypts your internet traffic and hides your real IP address, keeping these companies from ever getting your information. But it can do much more than simply protect you. Surfshark allows us to switch digital locations so we can see content made around the world. And the Clean Web feature blocks pop-ups and ads before they even load, saving you loads of annoyance in today's digital landscape. You can install Surfshark on unlimited devices, and we make sure everyone on our team uses it. Right now, Surfshark is offering Economics Explained viewers a special deal. With our code, you can get 4 extra months for free. Go to surfshark.com/economics or use code economics at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. On paper, becoming a teacher or a doctor still looks like one of the safest bets you can make. Teachers tend to have stable contracts, predictable career paths, and regular hours, with pay that often catches up to or exceeds the national average wage over the course of a career. In the UK, for example, a qualified teacher's salary starts at about £32,916 a year, but can rise to around £51,000 or more with experience, with even higher scales in London. By contrast, the median full-time UK worker earns roughly £39,000 a year before tax. In other advanced economies, the pattern is similar. Across the OECD, teachers earn statutory salaries that cluster around $56,000 to $64,000 depending on the country and the education level they teach. That puts teacher pay around or slightly above the OECD's average annual wage, which sits at roughly $61,000. Doctors go even further. By the time they are fully qualified, physicians earn more than the average worker, with strong job security, global demand, and skills that remain extremely difficult to automate. In the US, the average doctor earns roughly $230,000 a year, with primary care physicians earning less and specialists earning significantly more. Meanwhile, the average US worker earns around $69,000 annually. The same pattern holds across other high-income countries, even if the absolute numbers are lower. According to the OECD, general practitioners typically earn 2 times the average national wage, while medical specialists often earn 2.5 times the average, depending on the country. Schools and hospitals are built on the assumption that teachers and doctors will always be there. Yet across rich countries, that assumption is on a collision course with reality. Despite all the apparent advantages, schools and hospitals are finding it harder to stay fully staffed. For most of the past century, the way rich countries supplied essential workers followed a fairly predictable pattern. Teachers and doctors were trained domestically, usually through heavily subsidised public systems, because governments understood these roles as core national infrastructure rather than ordinary market jobs. Each year, a new cohort of graduates would enter classrooms and hospitals, while older workers gradually retired. As long as the number coming in roughly matched the number leaving, the system stayed in balance. Schools remained staffed, hospitals kept functioning, and shortages were rare and usually temporary. That model worked because the underlying demographics supported it. Back then, populations were younger, birth rates were high enough to guarantee a steady flow of future workers, and demand grew slowly enough for systems to keep up. Training capacity didn't need to expand aggressively because replacement was gradual and largely self-sustaining. But now, the system is breaking down. Across almost every high-income country, populations are ageing rapidly, which puts pressure on healthcare from 2 directions at once. Many doctors are approaching retirement just as the population itself is getting older. In countries like Japan, Italy, and Germany, more than 1 in 5 people is already over the age of 65, and that share continues to rise. And older societies need more healthcare, not less, because people live longer and spend a greater share of their lives managing chronic conditions. At the same time, birth rates across developed countries have fallen well below the replacement level of 2.1 children per woman. In countries such as South Korea, Italy, Spain, and Japan, fertility rates now sit closer to 1.2 or lower, and even historically higher fertility countries like the UK, France, and the Nordics have seen sustained declines. In practical terms, this means fewer young people entering the workforce just as demand for teachers and doctors is accelerating. So the obvious question becomes, why don't we train more of them? The problem is that training new teachers takes years, and training doctors often takes a decade or more from university entry to full qualification. That means the shortages visible today are not the result of recent policy failures, but of decisions made 10, sometimes 20 years ago, like how many training sites to fund or how much strain these systems could be expected to absorb. When retirement waves arrive, there is no way to accelerate the pipeline quickly enough to compensate, and the pandemic just made this timing problem worse. COVID-19 didn't create the underlying shortage, but it exposed it, accelerating burnout and pushing many experienced teachers and healthcare workers into early retirement at exactly the moment demand was spiking. And once those workers leave, they can't be replaced quickly enough. But the deeper problem is that these shortages aren't just about timing, they're about incentives. While teachers and doctors earn above average wages, in many countries they earn less than other professions requiring similar levels of education, responsibility, and time investment. Also, public sector pay structures tend to place a ceiling on earnings over the course of a career, with defined salary bands that contrast with private sector professions, where pay can continue to scale with experience, performance, or market demand. At the same time, getting into these professions has become a longer and more expensive process, with higher student debt, rising housing costs in the cities where the work actually is, and a payoff that comes only after many years of training. Day-to-day work has also become more demanding. Long hours, administrative overload, and high responsibility have become normal, particularly in healthcare, where staff shortages feed directly into heavier workloads for those who remain. For many high-performing students, private sector alternatives often offer faster financial rewards, more flexibility, and fewer constraints, making teaching and medicine comparatively less attractive despite their long-term stability. So, the result is a slow compounding erosion. Fewer people begin training, more leave earlier than expected, and the workforce ages faster than it can be replaced. So, how have governments managed this problem until now? Pay raises and retention policies have helped, but when faced with shortages they can't fix quickly, most governments have reached for the same lever. If you can't train enough teachers and doctors at home, you bring them in from elsewhere. Migration is a faster fix than expanding universities. It's also cheaper than raising pay across the public sector and far easier politically than long-term reform. So governments redesigned their visa systems to compete for essential workers. Doctors and nurses were fast-tracked with processing times shortened compared with standard skilled visas. In the UK, that led to tens of thousands of arrivals in a single year. In 2022 alone, over 73,000 health and care workers were sponsored on skilled visas, and the number continued to rise into early 2023. So in the short term, visa changes did what they were meant to do. Over the past decade, this approach allowed schools and hospitals in developed countries to keep running without sudden spikes in class cancellations and hospital waiting lists. Even as some countries expanded training opportunities or experimented with retention bonuses, migration remained the fastest way to relieve pressure in the short term. The problem is that migration doesn't create new workers, it just moves them around. So, when high-income countries recruit teachers and doctors trained abroad, they're often pulling talent out of places that already have shortages of their own. In theory, that should at least protect developed countries from shortages, but in practice, it rarely does for long. Migrant professionals are less tied to a single system and more willing to move again once better opportunities appear, which means migration can keep filling gaps, but it struggles to build a stable workforce. You can see this clearly in the UK. For decades, the NHS has relied heavily on foreign-trained doctors to plug staffing gaps. Today, around 1/3 of doctors working in the UK were trained abroad, and roughly a quarter of NHS nurses are non-UK nationals, making their health service one of the most internationally dependent in the OECD. Many arrive, gain experience, and do essential work. But a significant share doesn't stay. Once they've built skills and credentials, some move on to better paying systems like the US or Australia, where salaries are far higher. So, the UK becomes a stepping stone rather than a destination. In the end, new doctors arrive and others move elsewhere, which leaves the underlying shortage largely unchanged. So, why not fix the problem at the source? Because the alternatives are politically and economically hard, so many policymakers are opting to just hit the snooze button on this problem for now. Governments can raise pay for teachers and doctors, but that strains public budgets and risks backlash from voters who don't benefit directly. Expanding domestic training is another option, but that takes years and requires sustained funding long before results show up. The UK government's NHS long-term workforce plan, for example, is backed by more than £2.4 billion in investment and aims to expand training and recruitment over the next 15 years. But a medical student who starts training today won't fully relieve pressure on the system for a decade or more. So, for politicians, the costs arrive immediately, but the benefits come far too late for an election cycle. That's why migration keeps being asked to do more than it can realistically deliver. It's the only tool that works quickly, but it comes at a price. It shifts shortages across borders, increases turnover, and delays the deeper reforms needed to make education and healthcare workforces sustainable again. And this is where the real risk sits. When shortages stop being temporary, systems adapt in ways that look functional on the surface while slowly degrading underneath. In education, it starts with class sizes creeping up. Once that happens, individual attention drops and schools quietly narrow what they can realistically teach, especially as less experienced teachers are asked to carry heavier loads. At first, the impact can seem manageable. Students still graduate and schools are still open. The real cost only shows up years later, because weaker skill formation today means lower productivity decades down the line. In fact, World Bank research shows that the quality of education, so how much students actually learn, matters far more for long-term economic growth than how long they stay in school. Countries where students leave school with stronger skills end up far richer over time, while those that fall behind on learning lock in lower growth for generations. Healthcare moves faster, so the consequences are even harder to ignore. When staff shortages become chronic, waiting times grow and diagnoses are delayed. Once this happens, outcomes worsen for conditions that are otherwise treatable. In England, for example, long waits in A&E have become so severe that the BBC reports there are 250 preventable deaths every week among patients waiting to be admitted, and a less healthy population is a less productive one. Fewer people are able to work consistently, more leave the labour force early, and healthcare systems end up treating preventable problems instead of preventing them in the first place. If you zoom out far enough, you can even see how shortages in schools and hospitals quietly reshape the economy. On one side, growth slows as skills and health erode. At the same time, access to education and healthcare becomes more unequal because those who can afford private alternatives opt out, while everyone else waits longer and gets less. Globally, the same dynamic plays out between countries. When high-income countries pull essential workers from abroad, lower-income countries lose the very professionals they need to build their own education and health systems, making future shortages even harder to escape. In Ghana, for example, roughly 7 out of 10 doctors trained during the 1990s were working overseas just a few years after graduating. The country invested in their training, but the benefits were largely realised elsewhere. Something similar happened in Kenya, where it's estimated that the emigration of just 167 doctors represented a loss of around $86 million in training investment alone, money that could have gone towards staffing hospitals and expanding care at home. The truth is that North America and Europe employ roughly 2/3 of the world's health workers, despite carrying only about 1/5 of the global disease burden. Africa, by contrast, bears nearly 1/4 of the disease burden with only 3% of the global health workforce. This is the long-term result of health workers moving from systems that need them most to systems that can pay more. So shortages affect everything from inequality to growth. But there's also evidence that this dynamic can be slowed and, in some cases, reversed. In countries where pay, working conditions, and training capacity were adjusted earlier, shortages have been easier to contain. Portugal, for example, spent 2 decades steadily expanding medical school capacity, eventually reaching around 5.8 doctors per 1,000 people. One of the highest ratios in Europe and well above countries like the US, which sits closer to 3.5 doctors per 1,000. With this approach, Portugal reduced its reliance on foreign inflows and helped stabilise staffing in primary care. Romania followed a different path. After heavy outflows in the 2010s, it raised pay, expanded training, and improved working conditions. Doctor immigration fell sharply, from around 1,500 a year in 2012 to fewer than 500 by 2021. This allowed the system to retain more of its own graduates and rebuild capacity from within, which tells us something important. Outcomes depend on policy choices. Where workloads are kept manageable and career paths remain attractive, systems are far better at holding on to the workers they train. Technology could help ease these shortages too, but only if it's used in the right way. AI shouldn't be a replacement for teachers and doctors, but a force multiplier. By reducing administrative work, speeding up routine tasks, or freeing professionals to focus on the parts of the job only humans can do, it can make these careers more sustainable rather than hollowing them out. In the end, the real danger isn't that societies suddenly wake up one day without teachers and doctors. It's that the system stop treating understaffing as a temporary problem to be solved. Once we start slowly accepting understaffing as the norm, the cost doesn't stay confined to classrooms and hospitals. It shows up in slower growth, weaker skills, poorer health, and a society that gradually loses the ability to replace the workers it depends on. And that brings us back to where we started. We're living through an age of job anxiety. In many parts of the economy, people are worried that technology won't just change jobs, it might eliminate them entirely. So, what happens in sectors where technology might make humans less necessary? If you want to push that original question further and see what happens when capitalism doesn't need workers anymore, we made an entire video exploring that exact thought experiment. You should be able to click to that on your screen now. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.